Welcome back to Dark Domain, where the most unsettling mysteries are only a phone call away. In tonight's video, we're diving into 3 stories that will leave you questioning what you hear in the dead of night. From unknown callers to voices in the static, these tales explore the terrifying consequences of picking up when you shouldn't. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever received a call that just didn't feel right? Unknown number. I was never the type to get paranoid about phone calls. You know, the stories you hear about weird numbers showing up on your caller ID, or the chain messages people use to send warning you about answering certain calls. I always thought that stuff was just urban legend. A little spooky, but not real. That changed last fall, and it started with a number, 999. It showed up on my cell at around 9 p.m. one night while I was in my apartment catching up on some work. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably just spam. I was used to the occasional weird caller since I'd given my number out to a lot of places for online orders and delivery services. Still, something about the number stuck with me. I mean, it was just 3 digits. Is that even a thing? I let it ring a few times before rejecting the call. No voicemail, no follow-up text. Just a deadline. A few days later, I got another call from the same number. 999. It was later this time, close to midnight. I had just finished watching a movie and was getting ready for bed when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Again, I ignored it. Something about the call felt too weird to answer. I figured it was a robo-dialer or some company trying to mess with me. I checked my phone the next morning, expecting to see a missed call notification. There wasn't one. But here's where things got strange. When I opened the call log, there was no record of it. No missed call, no incoming number from last night. It was like it had never happened. The calls came once a week, always from 999, and always at night. Sometimes I'd be watching TV, sometimes I'd be cooking or just scrolling through my phone. Every time I ignored the calls, thinking maybe the number would give up or the system would reset. But each time I checked the log after, there'd be no record of them. No missed calls, no history. I started telling a couple of friends about it, trying to laugh it off as some dumb technical glitch or a phone company messing up the system. A few of them joked that I was being targeted by some weird spam company or a hacker who liked to mess with people. I wasn't too bothered by it, but deep down it unsettled me. Who could call me so many times without leaving a trace? The next call was different. It was a Saturday night and I was at home just relaxing with a beer after a long week. I wasn't even thinking about the calls anymore. They were becoming part of the routine. But this time when the phone rang, I noticed something different on the screen. Incoming call yourself. That stopped me cold. The number that was calling wasn't the 999 number. It was mine. My own number. My name showing up on the caller ID like I was calling myself. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. How could I be calling myself? I didn't answer. I let it ring out, my heart pounding as I watched the phone light up and then go dark. When the call finally stopped, I checked my call log, half expecting it to be gone like the other ones. But it wasn't. There, clear as day, was a record of the call. Incoming call from yourself. That's when the messages started. The next night, around 10:30, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number, but not just any number. It was the 999 number again. The message was simple. "Why didn't you answer?" My stomach twisted as I stared at the words. There was no way this was a glitch or a spam company. Whoever or whatever was behind this, they knew I wasn't answering on purpose. They wanted me to pick up. I didn't reply. The next message came a minute later. "We know you're there, Alex." I dropped my phone like it had burned me. How did they know my name? I hadn't given my name out to any weird companies or entered it into any sketchy websites. It didn't make sense. I sat on the couch, my heart racing, watching the phone as it lay on the floor, the screen dim. I had to be imagining this. It was some elaborate prank. Maybe one of my friends was messing with me, or someone had figured out how to spoof numbers. But when I picked up the phone, the messages were still there. And worse, Another one came through. Pick up the next call. The next week was hell. I was jumpy, constantly checking my phone, terrified that it would ring again. I told myself I'd go to the phone company, get a new number, report the harassment. But every time I tried, something stopped me. Maybe it was just curiosity, or maybe I was afraid it wouldn't fix anything. The calls continued. Always the same time, always from 999 or my own number. I started losing sleep, staying up late just to see if the call would come. Every time I'd let it ring out, refusing to pick up, waiting to see what would happen next. Then one night I finally caved. It was a Tuesday about 11:45 p.m. The call came through as usual, 999 flashing on the screen. My heart was pounding as I stared at it, knowing I shouldn't answer, but the messages had gotten to me. They were insistent, aggressive. Pick up. You have to answer. Without thinking, I swiped to answer the call and held the phone to my ear. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just dead silence. No static, no voice. Then faintly, I heard something in the background. Breathing. Slow, steady, like someone was standing right next to me. "Who is this?" I whispered, my voice shaking. There was a long pause. Then finally, a voice came through. It was soft, distorted, almost like someone speaking from a distance. "We told you not to ignore us." I froze, my blood running cold. "Who are you?" The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it whispered something that sent chills down my spine. "Check the window." My breath caught in my throat. I was sitting on the couch, facing the window that overlooked the street outside. The curtains were drawn, but there was just enough space between the fabric for me to see the faint glow of a streetlight. I didn't want to look, I didn't want to know. But slowly I stood up, the phone still pressed to my ear, and stepped toward the window. With my free hand, I reached for the curtain and pulled it aside. There was no one outside, just the empty street, the faint hum of traffic in the distance. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe it really was just a prank after all. Then the voice spoke again. "Look closer." And that's when I saw it. Just a faint shadow, standing perfectly still across the street, barely visible in the dim light. Watching me. I dropped the phone and slammed the curtains shut. I moved out of that apartment a week later. I don't know who or what was behind the calls, and I don't want to know. I got a new number, switched phones, and haven't had any strange calls since. But every once in a while, when I'm sitting in my new place, I'll feel it. The urge to check my phone to see if the 999 number has come back. So far it hasn't. But sometimes late at night, I'll hear the faint buzzing of my phone on the nightstand, and I'm too afraid to check who's calling. The wrong number. It was the summer after I graduated from college when the calls started. At that time, I was living in Pittsburgh, just outside the city, in this run-down apartment complex that catered to broke recent grads like me. It wasn't a great neighborhood, but the rent was cheap, and the noise from the nearby highway blended into the background after a while. I was staying with my best friend Kyle, who I'd known since high school. We were both just trying to figure out life after school. He'd gotten a job at a tech firm downtown, and I was working at a local grocery store while applying for something better. We had a small 2-bedroom apartment, the kind where the carpet was stained and the windows barely opened. We didn't care. It was our first real place, and we'd spend most of our nights hanging out, playing video games or watching movies. But then the phone call started. It was a Friday night in June, and Kyle had gone out with some coworkers for drinks, leaving me alone in the apartment. I didn't mind. I just cracked open a beer and was getting ready to binge-watch some old episodes of The Twilight Zone when the phone rang. Now this was our landline, one of those old cordless phones we'd gotten because it came free with our internet plan. Neither of us used it much. We both had cell phones, but we kept the landline plugged in just in case. I figured it was some telemarketer, but something about it felt off. It was 11:30 at night, way too late for a normal sales call. I stared at the phone for a second, debating whether or not to answer, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked up. "Hello?" At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then after a few seconds, I heard this strange clicking noise, like someone was tapping their finger against the phone. It was slow and deliberate. Finally, a voice came through. It was a woman's voice, soft but oddly robotic, like she was speaking through some kind of distortion. "Is Kyle there?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't strange for people to call and ask for Kyle. His friends sometimes called the landline if they couldn't reach him on his cell. But something about the way she asked felt weird. No," I replied. "He's not home right now. Can I take a message?" There was a pause, then the clicking noise started again. "No message," she said, her voice low and flat. "I'll call back." And then, just like that, she hung up. When Kyle got home later that night, I told him about the weird call. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a wrong number or someone trying to prank us. I wanted to believe him, but something about the way the woman had spoken, like she knew Kyle, made my skin crawl. Over the next few days, I forgot about it. Life went on as usual. Kyle went to work, I put in applications at different places around town, and we spent our nights watching TV and playing Xbox. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But a week later, the phone rang again. It was late, past midnight this time, and both of us were in the living room watching a movie. The landline rang, cutting through the quiet. Kyle glanced at me, clearly not in the mood to answer, so I picked it up. "Hello?" I said, my voice a little sharper than before. This time there was no clicking, just silence. I waited, thinking it was another telemarketer or a robocall. Then faintly I heard the same woman's voice from before. "Is Kyle there?" she asked again, her voice just as emotionless as the first time. I hesitated. "Who is this?" I asked, my heart starting to race. There was a long pause, then the clicking sound returned. "I need to talk to him," she said. "I need to know where he is." My chest tightened. Something about the way she asked sent a cold chill down my spine. I covered the receiver and looked at Kyle. "It's her again," I whispered. "She's asking for you." He frowned, taking the phone from me. "Who is this?" He listened for a few seconds, his face twisting in confusion. Then he pulled the phone away and hung up. "What did she say?" I asked. "Nothing," he muttered, sitting back down. "Just breathing. She's messing with us." A few nights later, the calls became more frequent. Every time it was the same thing. The phone would ring and the woman would ask for Kyle. Sometimes she'd ask if he was home. Sometimes she'd ask where he was, but the questions were always the same. She wanted to know about Kyle. I tried blocking the number, but the calls always came from unknown, so there was no way to stop it. After a while, we just stopped answering the landline altogether. We unplugged it, thinking that would be the end of it. But then things got worse. One night, I woke up to a soft buzzing sound. It was my cell phone vibrating on the nightstand. Groggy and half asleep, I reached over and picked it up. Private number. Confused, I swiped to answer. "Hello?" For a moment, there was nothing but dead air. Then that same voice came through, quieter than ever. "Is Kyle there?" I bolted upright in bed, my pulse racing. "How did you get this number?" The voice didn't answer. Just more static, then that slow, deliberate clicking sound. "Kyle needs to be careful," she whispered, her voice so low it was almost drowned out by the static. "They're watching him." I hung up and immediately ran to Kyle's room, banging on his door until he opened it, bleary-eyed and annoyed. "Dude, she called my cell," I blurted, trying to catch my breath. "She knows our numbers? She said someone's watching you." Kyle's face drained of color. "What? What are you talking about?" I explained everything, how the voice had warned me about him, how she had somehow gotten my personal number. He stared at me, wide-eyed, then grabbed his phone and checked his call log. He had missed a call too. We didn't know what to do. It wasn't like we could go to the cops with this. It was just a weird woman calling us in the middle of the night, nothing illegal about it. But there was something else, something darker happening, and we both knew it. The calls kept coming over the next few nights, always around the same time. I tried ignoring them, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment, every flicker of light from outside made me jump. Kyle was on edge too, constantly checking the locks, the windows, making sure everything was secure. Then one night the landline rang again. I don't know why, but I answered. Before I could say anything, the woman's voice came through, clearer than ever. "Kyle needs to leave," she said, her voice cold and deliberate. "He needs to get out. They're coming for him." I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking, and ran to Kyle's room. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." Kyle grabbed his things, and we bolted out of the apartment, not stopping until we reached the car. We drove around the city for hours, not talking, not knowing what to do. When we finally came back, the apartment was just as we'd left it, quiet, undisturbed. But neither of us could shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching. After that night, the calls stopped. I don't know why. Maybe whoever or whatever was after Kyle had moved on. Maybe the warning was enough. We never found out who the woman was or why she had been calling us. But sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed, I'll hear my phone buzz. And for a second, I'm terrified that it's her again. That voice in the static asking where Kyle is. The caller in the static. I had just gotten home from the night shift at the steel factory, dead tired, and ready to crash on the couch. My apartment wasn't much, just a small, one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a building in a pretty quiet part of Cleveland. It was the kind of place where the walls were too thin, but no one made noise because we were all too tired from work. That night I had kicked off my boots, grabbed a beer, and flipped on the TV for some background noise. Nothing was on, as usual. Just infomercials and reruns of shows I didn't care about. So I set it to a nature documentary and lay down, fully intending to pass out. That's when the landline rang. Now, I still had a landline because of the bundle deal I got with the internet, but no one ever called me on it. It was mostly used for junk calls. I kept it unplugged sometimes, but that night it was still connected. Groaning, I reached over from the couch and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Silence. Nothing but the faint hum of static in the background. I figured it was one of those automated calls where they mess up the connection. I was about to hang up when, faintly, I heard someone on the other end. It wasn't clear, just a breathy noise like someone exhaling. Then, in a broken, crackling voice, I heard my name. "Jeremy." I sat up immediately, my body stiffening. Whoever it was sounded far away, like they were calling from a bad connection or an old radio. "Hello?" I asked again, my heart picking up speed. "Who is this?" For a moment, there was just more static, that low hum. Then the voice came back, clearer this time, but distorted, like a bad recording or something. "Help. Me." I froze. The voice didn't sound panicked like someone in danger, but there was something about the way they said it that crawled under my skin. It was slow, distant, like a whisper in an empty room. I hung up. The next day, I chalked it up to some weird prank. Maybe a drunk guy dialing the wrong number, or one of those automated robocalls that glitched out. I didn't think much of it, except that it left me feeling uneasy. The way the voice said my name, it was just too specific. That night, I was back on the couch trying to unwind from another long shift when the phone rang again. I checked the clock, 2 a.m., same time as before. I didn't want to answer it, but something about it felt off, like ignoring it would only make things worse. I hesitated for a second before grabbing the phone. "Hello?" I said, a little more forcefully this time. The static was back, louder now, buzzing through the line. I strained to hear anything over it, and then the voice came again. This time it was clearer. "Jeremy, help me." A chill ran down my spine. The voice was the same as the night before, faint, distorted, like it was coming from miles away, and it said my name again. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, just static. Then, finally, the voice came back, softer this time, like a faint whisper. "You know me." I slammed the phone down, my heart racing. I sat there in the dark living room, the hum of the TV the only noise, and tried to catch my breath. Whoever it was, they had called 2 nights in a row, and they knew my name. It wasn't random, it wasn't a mistake. For the next few days, I unplugged the landline. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I even considered calling the phone company to trace the number, but it felt like I'd be overreacting. Still, I was on edge. I kept the TV on at night, needing some noise to drown out the eerie quiet of my apartment. A week passed without incident, and I started to relax. Maybe whoever it was had given up. But then one night, I forgot to unplug the phone before bed. It rang at 2 a.m. like clockwork. I sat up in bed, staring at the phone from across the room. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a full minute, I just let it ring, debating whether or not I should answer. But something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe fear, compelled me to pick up the receiver. This time I didn't even say anything, I just listened. The static was louder now, more aggressive, like wind roaring through a tunnel. And then, through the noise, I heard the voice again. "You left me." I felt my stomach drop. The voice was unmistakably familiar now. I hadn't noticed it before, but this time, I knew. "Brian," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. More static. The line crackled violently before the voice spoke again, more insistent this time. "You left me," it repeated. "You let me die." I could barely hold onto the phone. My hand was shaking, my mind spinning. Brian had been one of my best friends back in high school, but we drifted apart after graduation. A few years later, I heard he had died. Suicide. He had struggled with depression, and I hadn't been there for him when he needed me most. It had been years since I thought about Brian, but here he was, or at least something pretending to be him. I didn't know," I stammered, my throat tight. "I didn't know how bad it was." The static swelled, roaring in my ears. And then, just before the line went dead, the voice spoke one last time, sharp and accusing. "You should have saved me." The phone clicked. Silence. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about Brian, about how I had drifted away, how I had failed to check in on him when he needed someone. But how could this be real? Brian was gone, had been for years. This had to be some kind of sick prank, someone messing with me, digging up old wounds. I tried to forget about it. But the calls didn't stop. Every night, 2 a.m., the phone would ring. I stopped answering after that last conversation. I couldn't bear to hear his voice again. But even though I didn't pick up, the phone would ring and ring and ring. It became part of my routine, lying there in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ringing until it eventually stopped. But then, the phone started ringing at different times. It was as if the caller was getting more desperate, more determined to reach me. And then it wasn't just the phone. One night I woke up to the sound of static, not from the phone, but from the TV. I had turned it off before bed, but there it was, blaring static into the room, the screen flickering in the dark. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Then, through the crackling noise, the voice came again. "Jeremy!" It wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was coming from the TV. I grabbed the remote and shut it off, but the voice didn't stop. I could still hear it, faint and broken, coming from the speakers even though the screen was black. "You should have saved me." I ran out of the apartment that night and never went back. I don't know who or what was calling me, but I know one thing. It wasn't Brian. Not really. Whatever it was, it used his voice, his memory, to get inside my head, to make me feel guilty, like I had done something wrong. And maybe I had. But this was something else, something darker, I got rid of the landline, sold the apartment, and moved across town. I still don't know what was happening, but every now and then, when I'm lying awake late at night, I think I hear it. That faint crackle of static, like a bad connection on an old radio. And I wonder if one day it'll find me again. And that concludes tonight's journey into the dark unknown. 3 calls you should never have answered, and 3 reminders that sometimes the past isn't as buried as we'd like to think. If these stories left you checking your phone a little more nervously, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more unsettling tales, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever received a call that just didn't feel right? We'll be waiting for your stories in the dark domain.